The summer evening air was soft and heavy with the scent of pine and sun-baked grass when Tessa Morgan first saw him. She had just returned to Boise, Idaho, the small town where she had grown up under the care of her grandmother, Lucille. Life, for once, seemed to be aligning. At 23, she had finally graduated from a state college with a degree in elementary education. In a few short weeks, she would stand before a classroom full of children, chalk in hand, teaching them to read and write. It was the future she and Grandma Lucille had dreamed of through years of lean winters and second-hand clothes. A future built on stability, purpose, and quiet joy. Yet nothing in Tessa's meticulously planned life had prepared her for the moment their eyes met. It happened by chance on a warm July afternoon. She and her childhood friend Lily had stepped off the bus near the new grocery store construction site. Tessa's thoughts were still tangled in lesson plans and the small apartment she and Lucille hoped to renovate before fall. Then, without warning, her gaze caught his. He was unloading sacks of cement into a massive mixer, sweat glistening on his tan skin beneath the harsh Idaho sun. His name, she would later learn, was Marco Rivera, a seasonal construction worker from Texas. In that instant, the noise of the street, the rumble of machinery, the shouts of foremen all dissolved. He froze mid-movement, dark curls tumbling over his forehead, and stared back at her with eyes so deep and steady she forgot to breathe. It was as if some invisible thread had pulled taut between them, binding two strangers in a wordless understanding neither could explain. Someone shouted his name. "Marco! Let's go!" He blinked, tore his eyes from hers, and called back, "Coming!" But the spell was already cast. Tessa lowered her gaze and hurried away, cheeks burning. Lily teased her for the rest of the walk home, but Tessa barely heard a word. Something inside her had shifted. That night, she lay awake listening to the crickets outside her window, replaying the brief encounter until the edges of her memory blurred. Days passed, then a week. Rain swept through Boise, drumming against the tin roof of Lucille's old house and keeping Tessa indoors. But the storm cleared at last, and with it came an unexpected knock on their door. Grandma Lucille, practical as ever, had called for help repairing the leaking roof. The crew that arrived was from the same construction team, and among them was Marco. He was just as she remembered, tall, broad-shouldered, with a quiet confidence in the way he moved. When their eyes met across the kitchen as she served soup to the workers, the room seemed to shrink around them. Marco smiled, slow and disarming. Later, as the men left, he lingered a moment behind the others, brushing his fingertips gently against Tessa's hand, a fleeting, electric touch that left her breathless. That night, long after Lucille had gone to bed, a soft tapping came at Tessa's window. She opened it without hesitation. Marco was there, his face lit silver by the moonlight. He reached up, hand strong and warm, and lifted her down from the sill. Then came the first hesitant brush of lips, the rush of blood that drowned out everything else, the fierce, dizzying pull that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Time unraveled as they wandered barefoot through the meadow behind Lucille's house, whispering secrets and promises under the canopy of stars. Marco held her as if the world might end at dawn. And when dawn did come, pale and slow over the fields, he pressed his forehead to hers and whispered, "I have to go just for a few days. When I come back, I'll ask your grandmother for your hand." Tessa laughed softly, tracing the line of his jaw as if to memorize it. "And if she says no?" "She won't," he said simply, "because I'm never leaving you." As he disappeared into the early morning mist, Tessa stood at the window long after he was gone, fingers still tingling where he had touched her. She didn't know how it was possible to fall so deeply, so quickly, after only a handful of stolen glances and one moonlit night. But she did not question it. Her heart had chosen, and its choice was Marco Rivera. That night, their first and only night, would live inside her forever, sealed beneath the Idaho stars. And with Marco's promise echoing in her chest, Tessa believed with all her heart that the future she had dreamed of was finally beginning. The morning after that magical night, the world felt lighter. Tessa woke to sunlight spilling through her curtains, her heart beating with a rhythm she had never known before. Marco's promise echoed in her head, "I'm never leaving you." She hummed to herself as she helped Grandma Lucille make pancakes, every small task touched by quiet joy. She even caught herself glancing at the old oak tree by the back fence, half expecting to see Marco leaning against it with that disarming smile. Life, for the first time, felt boundless. But joy is a fragile thing, and sometimes it shatters without warning. It happened that afternoon. Tessa was sorting through lesson plans when a neighbor from down the street appeared at their door, his face pale and eyes downcast. "There's been an accident at the mill," he said gently. "One of the construction workers, a young man named Marco Rivera, he didn't make it." The words didn't register at first. They felt foreign, impossible, like a line from someone else's story. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That's not. He's coming back. He promised he would." But the man's expression didn't change. Marco had been struck by a falling beam during a loading mishap. The paramedics said he died instantly. His body, they added, was being transported back to Texas that very night to be buried near his family. Tessa stood motionless as the world around her collapsed. It wasn't supposed to end like this, not before it even began. She ran to the construction site, hoping for some mistake, some miracle. But by the time she arrived, the place was empty, the dust settling over a patch of ground marked by yellow tape. No one was there. No one would be. Marco was gone. For 2 days, she barely left her bed. The pillow smelled faintly of summer wind and pine sap, and she clutched it like it might tether her to the memory of his touch. Lucille sat beside her, stroking her hair in silence. "Some loves," the old woman murmured, "are meant to shape us, even if they don't stay." But the words brought no comfort. All Tessa could feel was the hollow ache where Marco's future, their future, had been. Then, just as the edges of her grief began to dull, another blow struck. Lucille, who had been complaining of chest pain, collapsed in the kitchen 3 days after Marco's accident. The ambulance came too late. By the time they reached St. Luke's Hospital, her grandmother, the woman who had raised her, sacrificed for her, believed in her, was gone. The funeral was a blur of condolences and casseroles, of neighbors she barely knew pressing her hands and saying things like, "She lived a good life." Tessa heard none of it. She stood beside the grave as the last shovelful of earth fell, numb and empty, the world now stripped of both the man she loved and the only family she had ever known. Her despair deepened days later when 2 of her aunts, women she hadn't seen in years, arrived unannounced. They carried folders, spoke in clipped tones about deeds and inheritance. It turned out Lucille had transferred the house's title to her eldest daughter years before, a decision Tessa had never known about. "It's nothing personal," one aunt said briskly, "but we're selling the property. We already have a buyer." "What about me?" Tessa asked, her voice small. "You're young," the other replied with a shrug. "You'll figure something out." 2 weeks after burying Lucille, Tessa found herself standing on the front steps of the only home she'd ever known, clutching a single suitcase. A for sale sign leaned against the mailbox. The windows she had helped wash every spring were now shuttered. She stared at them until the shapes blurred and dissolved into tears. She rented a tiny room above a neighbor's garage, a kindness from Mrs. Nura, who had known Lucille since childhood. But the space was cold and foreign, stripped of memories. Tessa spent her nights staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of how everything could vanish so quickly. Just days ago, she had been planning her classroom, dreaming of a wedding, a future. Now Marco was gone. Lucille was gone. Even the house that held their laughter and love was no longer hers. It felt as though the universe had folded in on itself, crushing every piece of the life she thought she knew. All that remained was silence, the heavy, suffocating silence of a world that had taken everything from her. The weeks that followed blurred into a gray monotony, each day indistinguishable from the last. Tessa drifted through them like a ghost. She rose early to sweep the small room above Mrs. Nura's garage, helped with errands around the house to repay the woman's kindness, and returned each evening to stare out the narrow window at the fading light. The scent of pine and summer rain that once reminded her of Marco now only deepened the ache. Lucille's absence echoed through her bones. Every silence, every empty corner, a reminder that she no longer belonged anywhere. Mrs. Nura, a silver-haired widow with a sharp tongue and a softer heart, did what she could. She brought bowls of soup and jars of pickled vegetables, urged Tessa to eat, to step outside, to think of the future. "Lucille wouldn't want you wasting away like this," she'd say, patting Tessa's hand. But the future was a word that no longer held meaning. Marco had been her future. Lucille had been her anchor. Without them, time felt suspended. It was on one of those quiet afternoons, as golden leaves began to scatter across the yard, that Daniel Porter reappeared in her life. They had gone to the same high school, though he'd been 2 years ahead, tall, good-natured boy who drove an old Chevy and dreamed of seeing the country. Life, it seemed, had been less kind to him too. Now 27, Daniel was a long-haul truck driver and a widower. His wife had died suddenly 3 years earlier, leaving him alone with a 3-year-old daughter, Sophia. He found Tessa sitting on the porch steps, knees drawn to her chest. "I heard about Lucille," he said quietly. "And Marco." She managed a nod, unable to trust her voice. Daniel visited often after that. Sometimes he brought Sophia, a shy little girl with wide hazel eyes and a stuffed rabbit she carried everywhere. Other times he simply sat beside Tessa in silence, talking about the road, the stars he chased across state lines, the ache of raising a child who asked for her mother every night. Slowly, his presence became a small comfort, not healing, but a steady hum against the sharp edges of grief. One evening, as the first snow dusted the rooftops, Daniel spoke the words that would change both their lives. "Tessa," he said, voice steady but soft, "I can't do this alone anymore. Sophia needs a mother. And you," he paused, searching her face. "You need a home. We could help each other." She stared at him, startled. "Daniel, I can't. I'm not asking you to love me," he interrupted gently. "I'm asking you to let us build something together. Maybe love will come in time. Maybe it won't. But we'd both stop drifting." For days, she wrestled with his proposal. Every fiber of her being still belonged to Marco, the memory of his laugh, his promise, the ghost of that night under the stars. The idea of standing beside another man felt like a betrayal. Yet so did the thought of spending her life alone, hollow and rootless. She thought of Sophia, of the way the little girl's hand had curled trustingly around her finger. She thought of Lucille, who had raised her not to run from life, even when it hurt. A week later, Tessa found herself in a borrowed dress, standing beside Daniel in the small chapel at St. Luke's. There were no flowers, no music, no guests beyond Mrs. Nura and a few of Daniel's friends from the trucking company. Sophia clutched her stuffed rabbit and beamed up at her new mommy. The officiant's words washed over Tessa in a blur, her mind drifting somewhere far away, to a field under the Idaho stars, to a voice promising, "I'm never leaving you." When the ceremony ended, Daniel slipped a simple gold band onto her finger. "Thank you," he whispered, as if he knew this was more surrender than celebration. That night, back in the small house Daniel rented on the edge of town, Tessa stood by the window and watched snow fall under the streetlights. It was a quiet, steady snow, not the kind that storms in, but the kind that covers everything gently layer by layer. She wondered if that was how healing worked too. Not all at once, but slowly, imperceptibly, until one day you woke up and the ground beneath you was no longer barren. For now, though, her heart remained elsewhere. She was a wife, a stepmother, a woman with a roof over her head. But the part of her that belonged to Marco, the part that had believed in forever, still stood barefoot in a summer field, beneath a sky full of stars. The early months of marriage were awkward, hesitant, like learning the steps to a dance neither of them had chosen. Yet, slowly, the rhythms of a new life began to take shape. Daniel was kind, not passionate like Marco had been, but steady and dependable. He brought Tessa coffee before his long hauls, left notes on the kitchen counter when he'd be gone for days. And Sophia, sweet, shy Sophia, clung to her hand as if she had always been there. Within a week, the little girl began calling her Mom, the word tumbling out one night at bedtime as naturally as breathing. It startled Tessa, but it also stirred something deep inside her, a fragile sense of belonging she hadn't felt since Lucille's passing. In September, Tessa finally stepped into a classroom of her own. 25 bright-eyed second graders filled the room with chatter and curiosity. They handed her crayon drawings, asked endless questions, and called her Ms. Morgan with affection that melted the cold edges of her grief. Life was not what she had once imagined, but it was life nonetheless, steady, structured, and even at times gentle. Then, one morning in late October, she felt an unfamiliar wave of nausea roll through her. A test confirmed what she hadn't dared to hope. She was pregnant. When she told Daniel, his face lit up with a joy she hadn't seen before. "A boy," he said with quiet certainty, his hands resting on her waist. "I can feel it. A son." Over the next months, he spoke often of the future, of building a swing set in the yard, teaching his son to drive the old Chevy, taking him on road trips across state lines. His excitement was infectious. Tessa found herself smiling more, humming as she graded papers or folded tiny onesies. And though she did not say it aloud, a small part of her was excited too. Perhaps this child could knit together the frayed edges of their marriage, binding them into something whole. But as her belly grew, so did an unease she couldn't name. Late at night, when the house was quiet, her mind drifted back to that night in the meadow, to Marco's hands and voice and the way the stars had seemed to pulse with their heartbeat. It had been 9 months ago. No more, no less. She pushed the thought away, too painful, too complicated, and told herself the dates didn't matter. This was Daniel's child. It had to be. Labor came early, in her 36th week. The contractions started before dawn, sharp and relentless, and by the time Daniel rushed her to St. Luke's Hospital, snow was falling softly outside. Hours later, amid the antiseptic light and hum of monitors, a cry pierced the air. A boy, tiny but strong, with a head full of dark hair and lungs that announced his arrival with startling force. "He's perfect," Daniel whispered, tears bright in his eyes as he placed the swaddled newborn in her arms. He kissed her forehead and, later that evening, returned from the hospital gift shop with a delicate gold necklace. "For the mother of my son," he said proudly. But not everyone was celebrating. As Tessa dozed in the postpartum room, voices drifted in from the hallway, hushed but unmistakable. "Irene, stop," a nurse hissed. "I'm just saying," came Irene Porter's voice, Daniel's younger sister, who worked in the maternity ward. 36 weeks, but he looks full term. And that hair, that skin tone, doesn't look like Daniel to me. "You shouldn't be talking like that," the other nurse warned. "HIPAA, remember?" "Fine," Irene muttered. "But people talk. And I remember a certain construction worker hanging around here last summer. Dark hair, dark eyes just like that baby." The words sliced through Tessa like glass. She turned her face to the wall, her heart thundering. No, it's not true. But the math marched forward, ruthless and undeniable. 36 weeks. 9 months. 1 night under the stars. Marco. Her breath came shallow and quick. The walls of the hospital room seemed to close in. Daniel was in the cafeteria, telling anyone who would listen about his new son. He didn't know. He couldn't know. And now, Tessa wasn't sure if she wanted him to. When he returned, cradling a paper cup of coffee, she forced a smile. He's beautiful, he said, gazing at the baby with unguarded love. Yes, Tessa whispered, her throat tight. He is. But inside, her heart was splitting open. The child in her arms was the embodiment of the most beautiful night of her life, and the beginning of a truth that could destroy the fragile peace she had built. It happened on a rainy Thursday evening, 3 weeks after Dennis was born. Daniel had been unusually quiet all day, his smile strained, his eyes distant. When Tessa asked what was wrong, he muttered something about needing air and disappeared into the garage. Hours passed. When he returned, the storm outside had worsened, and so had the one inside their home. "I talked to Irene," he said flatly, standing in the doorway of their bedroom. "She says the baby looks nothing like me, that he looks like some construction worker who was here last summer." Tessa's heart thudded painfully. "Daniel, please, is it true?" His voice was ice. "Is he even mine?" Silence stretched between them. Rain lashed against the windows. Tessa tried to speak, but the words tangled in her throat. "I don't know," she whispered. "It was one night before you and I. The explosion was immediate." Daniel's face contorted in rage. "Before us? And you didn't think that mattered? You let me believe he was my son." He swept his arm across the dresser, sending a framed photo crashing to the floor. "You married me. You let me hold him. And all this time he might not even be mine." Tessa dropped to her knees, clutching his hands. "I didn't know I was pregnant when we got married," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "I swear, Daniel, I wasn't trying to lie. I hoped," he yanked his hands away. "You hoped I'd never find out. You hoped I'd just raise another man's child without knowing." His words cut deeper than any blade. "You disgust me." The days that followed were worse than anything Tessa had endured before. Daniel didn't leave her, but he withdrew into himself, retreating behind a wall of bitterness she could not breach. He stopped sleeping in their bed, stopped eating meals with her. He barely looked at Dennis, and when he did, his eyes hardened as if the boy were a reminder of every betrayal in his life. Tessa tried everything: apologies, explanations, desperate attempts at conversation. But Daniel's anger had calcified into something colder. "He can stay," he told her one night without meeting her gaze. "I'm not throwing a baby out into the street, but don't you ever call him my son again." The rejection crushed her. She still woke up for every feeding, still rocked Dennis to sleep, still kissed his tiny forehead and whispered that he was loved. But inside a hollowness grew. Every time Daniel passed her in silence or slammed the door on his way out, the hollow widened. The neighbors noticed too. Boise was a small town, and word spread quickly. Irene's whispers slithered through church pews and grocery store aisles until they became a story everyone seemed to know. The young wife who tricked a good man into raising another man's child. People who once waved now turned away. Mothers at the playground gathered their children when Tessa arrived, muttering words like homewrecker under their breath. Even Dennis wasn't spared. "That's the outsider," a boy once said loudly as she pushed the stroller past the library. "My mom says he's not even Mr. Porter's real kid." Tessa bit her lip so hard it bled. She told herself that Dennis was too young to understand, too innocent to feel the cruelty aimed at him. But she felt it, every barb, every sideways glance, and it gnawed at her until she barely recognized the woman she had become. Daniel started leaving the house more often. At first, he claimed he needed to clear his head. Then the explanations stopped altogether. Some nights he stayed out until dawn, returning with the smell of whiskey clinging to his jacket. Other times he didn't return until the next day. Tessa lay awake through those long nights, listening to the clock tick and Dennis breathe softly in his crib. She prayed for something, a sign, a word, even an outburst, that meant Daniel still saw her as more than the source of his humiliation. But the silence stretched on, heavy and endless. A year passed like that, a long, bleak year of separate beds and cold dinners, of whispered gossip and slammed doors. Tessa counted time not by months, but by Dennis's milestones. His first smile, his first laugh, the day he rolled over on the living room rug while Daniel was out. Each one was a tiny, bittersweet reminder that life kept moving, even when love stood still. And yet, beneath the grief and shame, one thing never changed. Every time she held Dennis close, felt the warmth of his small body against her chest, she knew with absolute certainty that he was hers. No matter what Daniel said, no matter what the town whispered, she would protect him, even if it meant doing it alone. The first birthday arrived on a windy afternoon in March, a year to the day since Dennis had taken his first breath. Tessa baked a small vanilla cake and strung crepe paper around the living room, though her heart wasn't entirely in it. She wasn't sure who the party was for, Dennis, who would never remember it, or herself, desperate to mark a year she had somehow survived. Daniel had promised he'd come home early, but as the minutes dragged past, she doubted he'd keep that promise. But he did. Just as she was lighting the single candle on the cake, the front door opened and Daniel stumbled in. His eyes were bloodshot, his jacket reeking faintly of whiskey. Tessa tensed, but he didn't say a word. He dropped a crumpled bag on the coffee table and pulled out a small red toy truck, still in its plastic packaging. "Here," he muttered, handing it to Dennis, who was gurgling on a blanket near the couch. Then something unexpected happened. As Daniel crouched down, Dennis looked up at him, blinked those dark, curious eyes, and reached out. "Da-da," he babbled. Daniel froze. For a long moment, the room was utterly silent, the only sound the soft whistle of wind against the windows. Then he let out a shaky laugh, a sound that was part joy, part disbelief. "Son," he whispered, the word tumbling out as if against his will. The toy truck slipped from his hand and clattered to the floor. Dennis giggled, then pushed himself up, wobbling uncertainly on unsteady legs. He took one step, then another, his first steps, and staggered straight into Daniel's waiting arms. Tessa covered her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. She hadn't expected this moment, not here, not like this. Daniel clutched Dennis tightly, his shoulders shaking as he pressed his face into the boy's soft hair. "Son," he said again, this time louder, firmer. Something shifted that day. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a crack in the ice that had frozen their marriage for so long. In the weeks that followed, Daniel began coming home earlier. He stopped sleeping on the couch and started eating dinner at the table again. Sometimes, after Dennis had gone to bed, she'd catch him lingering by the crib, watching the boy sleep. Spring turned to summer, and with the thaw came more small changes. Daniel asked about Tessa's day. He offered to fix the leaky faucet. He even showed up unannounced at her classroom one afternoon with takeout and ate lunch with her and her students. They were small gestures, but they mattered. Slowly, cautiously, the distance between them began to shrink. Then, in late August, a new chapter unfolded. Tessa discovered she was pregnant again. This time there was no hesitation, no storm cloud hanging over the news. Daniel's face lit up when she told him, his joy unguarded and uncomplicated. "We're really starting over," he said, pulling her into his arms. The pregnancy was smoother than the first. Daniel was attentive, driving her to checkups, building a crib, painting a nursery in soft shades of green and cream. When labor began one crisp January night, he was there, gripping her hand through every contraction. Hours later, they welcomed a healthy baby boy. Daniel cried openly when the doctor placed the infant in his arms. "Michael," he whispered, "our son." This time, there were no doubts, no shadows cast over the delivery room. Tessa watched him cradle Michael with a tenderness that made her heart ache. He kissed the baby's forehead, then turned to Dennis, now toddling around the room, and scooped him up too. "You're brothers now," he said softly. For the first time in what felt like forever, their home was filled with warmth. The laughter of children echoed down the hallway, and dinners stretched into stories and sleepy giggles. Daniel wasn't the man he had been before betrayal tore them apart. The easy affection between them hadn't fully returned. but he was trying. And Tessa, though still carrying the scars of his anger and the weight of her own guilt, felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Hope that forgiveness might one day come. Hope that their marriage, though battered and imperfect, could grow into something real. They weren't healed yet, but as she watched Daniel lift both boys into his arms and spin them around until they squealed with laughter, Tessa knew they had taken the first steps, just as Dennis had, toward something better, something whole. It was a gray afternoon in early spring when the past came knocking on their door. Tessa had just settled Michael down for his nap when the doorbell rang. Wiping her hands on a dish towel, she opened the door to find an elderly woman standing on the porch, her coat damp from the drizzle and her expression heavy with something deeper than fatigue. Beside her stood a little girl, no more than 3 years old, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit and staring silently at the ground. "Are you Mrs. Porter?" the woman asked. "Yes," Tessa said cautiously. "Can I help you?" The woman hesitated, then sighed. "I'm Margaret Carter. This is Zoe." Her eyes softened as she looked down at the child. "She's Daniel's daughter." For a moment, the words didn't make sense. Tessa blinked, waiting for the air to clear, for the world to right itself. "I'm sorry, what?" "Her mother, Paula, passed away last week," Margaret said gently. "I'm her grandmother. I've been caring for her, but I'm not well. The doctors say I won't be able to raise a child much longer. And Paula told me Daniel is Zoe's father." The room tilted slightly beneath Tessa's feet. "Daniel!" she whispered, her throat dry. "I know this is a lot," Margaret continued, "but I can't do this alone. Zoe deserves to know her father, and Daniel deserves to know her." As if summoned by his name, Daniel appeared in the hallway, Michael balanced on his hip. He stopped short when he saw the pair at the door, his face draining of color. "Margaret," he breathed, "what are you doing here?" "Bringing your daughter home," she said simply. The silence that followed was suffocating. Tessa clutched the doorframe, her heartbeat roaring in her ears. "You have another child?" she asked, her voice trembling. Daniel's eyes closed briefly. "Before we married," he said. "It was before you, Tessa. Paula and we weren't serious. When she told me she was pregnant, I offered support, but she didn't want me involved. She said she could handle it." He swallowed hard. "I didn't even know Zoe existed until a few months ago. Paula reached out, but then she got sick and now she was gone, and the child standing in their doorway, tiny, trembling and lost, was his flesh and blood." Tessa felt a surge of anger, then confusion, then something she couldn't quite name. Betrayal? Maybe. But how could she call it betrayal when it happened before their marriage? Still, the ground beneath her felt unsteady, as if some invisible fault line had cracked open beneath their lives. They invited Margaret and Zoe inside. The little girl clung to her grandmother's skirt, her wide brown eyes wary as she scanned the unfamiliar room. "She's been through a lot," Margaret said softly. "Losing her mother, it's been hard. I can't take care of her any more," she added, her voice breaking. "But you can. You're her father." She handed Daniel a manila envelope, custody papers, notarized and official. "If you're willing." Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on Zoe. "Of course," he said, his voice rough. "She's my daughter." That night was the hardest any of them had faced in a long time. Zoe refused to eat. She screamed until her voice went hoarse when Margaret left. She refused to sleep unless she was curled up on the floor beside the door, as if terrified someone else might disappear if she closed her eyes. Tessa sat with her, whispering soft words, singing lullabies she hadn't sung since Sophia was small. None of it worked. Zoe stared back with tear-swollen eyes, too shattered to be comforted. But Sophia, 6 years old now, gentle and patient, approached quietly with a blanket and the same stuffed rabbit Zoe had clutched when she arrived. "You can sleep in my room," she offered shyly. "You don't have to cry alone." Something shifted. Zoe hesitated, then reached for Sophia's hand. That night, for the first time since losing her mother, she slept, curled beside Sophia on a twin bed covered in unicorn sheets. The following days were still difficult. Zoe cried often and called for Paula in her sleep. She refused to eat unless Sophia was beside her. She screamed if Daniel left the room. But slowly, painfully, the wall she had built around herself began to soften. She followed Sophia into the backyard, sat beside her at the breakfast table, and eventually began to speak in timid whispers. Tessa watched it all with a complicated mix of emotions: sorrow for Zoe, admiration for Sophia, and a cautious hope that they might all find a way forward. Life had handed them another unexpected chapter, one that neither she nor Daniel had asked for. But as she peeked into the girls' room one night and saw Sophia's small hand resting over Zoe's as they slept, Tessa felt something stir inside her. It wasn't resentment. It wasn't anger. It was the first, fragile thread of acceptance. The weeks after Zoe's arrival were some of the hardest Tessa had ever known. The house that had begun to feel warm and stable once again was now filled with cries in the night, sharp silences at the dinner table, and a constant undercurrent of tension she couldn't name. She told herself that Zoe was innocent, a little girl who had lost everything, but her heart didn't always listen. Each time she heard the child call Daddy in her small, trembling voice, something twisted inside her. Daniel was patient with Zoe in a way he hadn't been with anyone in a long time. He held her through her nightmares, read her stories until she fell asleep, and never once lost his temper when she clung to him with desperate fear. Tessa wanted to admire him for that, and part of her did, but another part resented how naturally he seemed to love this daughter born of another woman. Late at night, she lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling. The old wound, the betrayal she felt over Dennis, the bitterness that had nearly broken them, stirred again. It whispered cruel questions she didn't want to ask. Would he have loved her children as fiercely if they weren't his? Did Zoe's presence mean there would always be a part of Daniel she could never touch? It was during one of those sleepless nights that Daniel finally spoke. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly into the darkness. "For what?" Her voice was brittle. "For everything." He turned to face her. "For the anger. For the words I can't take back. For making you carry all of this alone. And now, for dropping another burden on you with Zoe." Tessa closed her eyes. "She's just a child," she whispered. "She is," he agreed. "But she's also a piece of my past I never told you about. I thought I was doing the right thing by staying away, but I was a coward. And now that Paula's gone, I can't undo any of it. All I can do is try to make it right. With her, with you, with all of them." Silence stretched between them, heavy but not suffocating. It was the first honest conversation they'd had in months. "I'm angry," she admitted. "Not at Zoe. Not really. But at how everything feels like it's spinning beyond my control. I keep thinking about Marco, about Dennis, about how our lives turned into something I never expected." Daniel reached for her hand. "I never expected this either," he said softly. "But I know one thing. I don't want to lose you. And I don't want our children growing up in a house where bitterness lives. I want us to build something stronger, not perfect, but real." Something in Tessa cracked then. The anger that had been simmering for so long loosened its grip, replaced by something quieter, not forgiveness yet, but the possibility of it. She thought of Dennis, of how fiercely she loved him even though he wasn't Daniel's biological son. She thought of Zoe, a child who had been thrust into their lives with no say in the matter. And she thought of Sophia and Michael, who deserved a home unshadowed by resentment. "I want that too," she whispered. From that night forward, things began to change. The process was slow, uneven, and often messy, but the change was real. Tessa stopped pulling away from Zoe and instead began reading to her alongside Sophia. She taught Dennis and Zoe to finger paint together on the back porch. Daniel, for his part, started spending more time with Dennis, proudly showing him how to fix a loose cabinet door or change the batteries in a flashlight. One evening, as she watched the 4 children tumble across the living room floor in a chaotic game of tag, Tessa felt a strange warmth bloom in her chest. Each of them, Sophia with her thoughtful eyes, Dennis with his boundless energy, Michael with his gummy smile, and Zoe with her fragile bravery, had come from different stories, different beginnings, and yet here they were, woven together into one family. "My little patchwork flock," she murmured to herself, the phrase slipping out unbidden. It felt right, imperfect, but right. Daniel heard her and smiled. "A pretty wonderful flock, if you ask me." In the months that followed, that patchwork nest grew stronger. The children bonded in ways Tessa hadn't dared to hope for. Zoe's nightmares became less frequent. Dennis started calling Daniel Dad without hesitation. Sophia took her role as big sister seriously, helping with bottles and bedtime stories. And Daniel, once distant and consumed by anger, became the man she had once hoped he could be, patient, present, and devoted. There were still scars, of course. There always would be. But scars, Tessa realized, were proof of healing, not evidence of brokenness. As she stood by the window one evening, watching Daniel chase the children across the yard while the setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, she felt peace settle over her for the first time in years. They had walked through fire and survived, and now, surrounded by laughter and love, Tessa knew that the life they were building, messy, complicated, beautiful, was exactly where they were meant to be. The house was never quiet anymore, and Tessa wouldn't have had it any other way. Laughter spilled from every corner, footsteps thundered down the hallway, and someone was always calling out, "Mom!" or "Dad," for one reason or another. The chaos that might once have overwhelmed her now felt like music, a living heartbeat pulsing through the home they had built together. On a golden autumn afternoon, Tessa stood on the porch with a mug of tea in hand, watching the backyard come alive with the small, beautiful details of their life. Sophia, now 7, was perched on the swing set reading aloud from a storybook, her voice patient and animated. Beside her sat Zoe, legs swinging, giggling at every dramatic voice her sister made. Their friendship had blossomed into something unbreakable. 2 little girls who had once been strangers now braided each other's hair, shared whispered secrets under the covers, and refused to sleep unless they were in the same room. A few feet away, Dennis was attempting to teach 3-year-old Michael how to kick a soccer ball. Michael mostly stumbled and laughed, but Dennis, older, protective, endlessly patient, clapped and cheered for every clumsy attempt. Tessa's chest tightened watching them. Dennis was growing fast, and with age had come questions. He knew now that his story was different, that his roots reached back to someone who was no longer here. One night, curled in her lap, he had asked, "Mama, do I belong?" Tessa had held him close, tears burning behind her eyes. "More than anything," she whispered, "you belong here. You always have." And it was true. Blood might have written the first lines of his story, but love was writing every chapter that followed. As if sensing her gaze, Dennis turned and waved at her now, his grin wide and bright. It was the same smile Marco had once given her under a summer sky, and for the first time it didn't hurt. It simply reminded her that love, even when it changed shape, never truly left. Daniel stepped out onto the porch beside her, slipping an arm around her waist. "Quite the circus we've got," he teased, nodding toward the scene unfolding before them. "A beautiful one," Tessa replied, leaning into him. They stood in silence for a moment, watching their children. Their children weave their own small world in the yard. Daniel's gaze lingered on Dennis, then on Zoe before returning to her. "Do you ever think about how close we came to losing this?" he asked softly. "All the time," she admitted. "And that's what makes it so precious." A shriek of laughter erupted from the yard as Michael toppled onto the grass and Dennis collapsed beside him in exaggerated defeat. Sophia and Zoe abandoned their swing to join the pile, and within seconds, all 4 children were rolling across the lawn in a tangle of limbs and giggles. Daniel chuckled, then walked down the steps and into the fray. Okay, he laughed, scooping Michael into one arm and Zoe into the other. Dennis and Sophia clung to his legs, refusing to let go until he scooped them up too, staggering under the weight of all four. Breathless and grinning, he looked up at Tessa. "There are no outsiders here," he said firmly, his voice carrying across the yard. "We are one family." Tessa felt her heart swell. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything they had endured, the grief and betrayal, the anger and forgiveness, the slow stitching together of wounds that had once seemed too deep to heal. She stepped down from the porch and joined them, wrapping her arms around Daniel's waist as the children piled around them. The sun dipped lower, painting the yard in shades of amber and rose, and for a moment, time itself seemed to pause. This, the laughter, the tangled limbs, the small hands reaching for hers, was the life she had once thought impossible. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and from the wreckage of heartbreak and loss, they had built something stronger than either of them had ever known. Tessa looked up at Daniel, at the family they had created together, and smiled. From the deepest wounds, she had found healing. From the greatest losses, she had built a home. And as the evening light wrapped around them like an embrace, she knew with absolute certainty that their journey, from sorrow to joy, from brokenness to belonging, was finally complete.